to the conversation between Sherilyn and MacGregor from the Sustainable Consumption Institute in Manchester, UK. And simultaneously, we've got David Schlosberg from the Sydney Environment Institute here in Sydney, Australia. I'm Christine Winter, and I'm a settler in Australia from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm a postdoc with the Sydney Environment Institute. So the reason I stated that I'm a settler is because that's an acknowledgement that we are on Gadigal land, unceded Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge the Gadigal philosophy of care, the care of country, their bodies of knowledge and their communities of human and non-human being. My research interests are around environmental justice, Indigenous justice, multi-species justice, and intergenerational justice. What a lot of justice. And particularly, I'm interested in the way that justice theories foreclose on Maori understandings of the world, Maori philosophy, Maori understandings of environmental and intergenerational justice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. That is really lovely. I'm Magdalena. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester, and I'll be co-chairing today with Christine. So I work at the intersection of feminist and environmental politics, very broadly speaking, under the supervision of Sherilyn and also Matthew Patterson. First of all, I would like to just draw a bit of attention to, why we're actually here today. And of course, it's in the title of the event. So the conversation starting point is really an article by Sherilyn in which she acts as a feminist killjoy, to use Sarah Ahmed's words in and in her paper, Sherilyn critiques the research process or a mechanism in research on sustainable materialism and a turn to the everyday in green political thought that doesn't necessarily reflect or maybe listen to past insight from ecofeminism. And however, in doing so, the killjoy or Sherilyn doesn't necessarily shut down conversations, but rather, as we see it, creates cracks to open possibilities. And we believe that when these possibilities are taken seriously, as shown by David being here today and us having this conversation, then there is potential for transformation and there's potential for collaborative research. So the purpose of this conversation today is really to start a conversation that will continue beyond this event. Ideally, that's what we hope for. And we really hope to inspire future research collaborations that widen the crack and illuminate areas for transformative research that takes seriously both existing research and, as we wrote in our event blurb, how can this conversation inspire new collaborative research, theorizing and writing that is inclusive, applied and generative for ecofeminist and materialist research agendas in particular, but also for environmental justice and politics in general. So the format we're going to follow today is that now Sherilyn and David will each have the opportunity to introduce themselves for 10 minutes, present their main arguments and the ways in which they have interacted over the past few years. And then following this, Christine and I will pose a couple of questions to both Sherilyn and David in the hopes to start shifting the focus away from critique or beyond critique towards synergies. And after that, the audience, you will have the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A function, as well as share ideas and thoughts, reflections via the Padlet linked below. But first of all, I'd like to hand back the word to Christine for a second and ask, why cracks? What was the idea behind starting with the lyrics from Cohen? And would you like to share a few thoughts on that?
So you all may be wondering why we chose to have some lyrics from Leonard Cohen at the beginning of the invitation to join us. It's rather an odd thing for us to have done. But interestingly enough, that piece of music has been evoked for me every time I have looked at, or David's talked about, Sherilyn's earlier paper, Finding Transformative Potential in the Cracks. What the lyrics do to me is remind us that we don't have to see a crack, we don't have to see damage, we don't have to see even critique as something that is bad, that something that has to be rejected. That in fact what it does is offers us opportunities for transformation. And I think that's what we are wanting from this conversation, is for it to be transformative. So the aim isn't simply to have the normal critique and response. We don't want this session, rather, to expose flaws and then just discard the effort. We want the crack here to acknowledge that in new materialism and in sustainable materialist research, that it can be more receptive to ecofeminist thinking. And I might add also that it can be more receptive perhaps to non-Western ways of thinking as well. So it is, as Sherilyn's article identified, in some ways flawed, and that is where the possibilities lie. Okay. So today we're opening the discussion to see where it leads, so that this is not a classic, as I say, not a classic critique and defense. The discussion is about opening the cracks wider to see what new research possibilities emerge. So I'll pass now to Sherilyn to talk to us about her article, how the paper came to be, where it sits in her body of research, and where her frustrations are with the terms of things like newness and around the sort of the academic habits of citation. Sherilyn.
Thanks, Christine and Magdalena, and hi, David. Yes, I'll get straight into talking about how the paper came to be. It was probably at least 5 years in the making, but it finally found a home in the 30th anniversary of Environmental Politics Journal, of which I'm an editor, and David also has a very long time association with as an editorial board member. And you know, it's really important to mention that mention Environmental Politics Journal, because you know it really has for me been a place to try out ideas, and certainly with this paper I owe a lot to the editor of the special issue, Graham Hayes, for giving the paper some early momentum, and also for providing the opportunity to discuss it with a number of different people over the years that it was coming into being. So I have had lots of conversations with colleagues and friends, and it was really important to have those conversations because as you will know, the article engages critically with some of the work of friends and colleagues that I've worked with over the years, including David. So sometimes I often felt a little bit vulnerable in making these criticisms, but we're going to talk about those this morning / evening. So where it sits in my research, well, it's really the kind of end, maybe not the end, but it comes after a long line of publications where I've been trying to do three main things. One is to problematize the tendency within environmental political thought to kind of ignore or fail to really get to grips with the gender power relations that shape all environmental problems and movements for change. And particularly the tendency to take for granted the gendered division of labor in everyday life, and the role of everyday life and everyday life practices in environmental relations and environmental movements. And secondly, I guess I also want to always problematize the lack of a productive engagement between environmental and now climate movements and feminist movements, both inside academia and within the political sphere. And here I often sort of have argued that feminists and environmentalists are sort of equally responsible for this lack of engagement, which is why I've always wanted to work at the intersections or trying to work to bring the two into conversation within ecological feminism. Third has been the need to want to highlight, the desire to highlight the way that ecofeminist scholarship has been, I think, inaccurately caricatured by some, dismissed by others, including feminists, for a range of different reasons that I don't always really understand. So kind of part of my project has been to try and set the record straight. And one of the things I've done recently is to put together a handbook of gender and environment. It was published a few years ago. And if it won't take up too much time, I just want to read a couple of the lines from the introduction, where I say that, that ecofeminist scholarship has always been motivated by the pursuit of justice in the face of diverse and interlocking forms of oppression. But it has also contributed theoretical insights in many cases that in many cases were ahead of their time. Arguably, gender and environment scholarship was materialist and post-humanist before these concepts gained popularity in the mainstream of Western academia. An intersectional analysis of capitalism, rationalist science, colonialism, racism, heterosexism, and speciesism has always been central to feminist environmental scholarship. And contrary to popular opinion in many corners of environmental studies, this work has very little to do with the claim that women are closer to nature than men. In fact, much of it is aimed at questioning the very ideas of women and nature, and at understanding the myriad ways in which gender as a social category and power relation shapes and is shaped by interhuman relations, as well as human relations with other species and the environment. Yet the idea that it is based on a simplistic narrative about women saving the planet persists in spite of the evidence. So my project has been to dispense with that caricature, hopefully once and for all. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what I've been working on. And this article that we're here to discuss today is part of that project of highlighting and correcting the absence of ecofeminist thinking in contemporary environmental political thought. And this time it looks at what I've kind of called an everyday turn, or a new turn within environmental political thought that has started, maybe around 2012, 13. I talk about, evidence, some of the moments and the publications and the conferences that have kind of brought this new interest in the everyday and everyday matters, everyday practices into discussion in environmental politics. And I want to really ask, so why is it that in this sort of new interest in everyday life and the politics of making environmental change and engaging with sustainability in everyday life, why is it that this scholarship has tended to look to other types of theoretical resources than ecofeminist thinking that I argue has always been interested in materiality and sustainability and the interconnections of matter and social relations. It has never not been materialist, as I want to say. So really, yes. The article tries to talk about that turn. Give some examples of some of the arguments in that literature, and then I respond by trying to say that it's really quite problematic to call this a new turn or to claim this as a new concern when in fact ecofeminists have been doing this for a very long time. And second, that if we are going to start to, take on a new approach to thinking about environmental politics that goes beyond, the realm of contentious politics or radical, radical movements that are more traditional in their framing around politics and social movements, that we do care about what happens in everyday life, then if we are going to embrace that, and I totally agree that we should, then some old feminist some old insights from ecofeminist politics and practice should be incorporated. And here I give examples of the work, you know, thinking about so feminist theories of ontology, so ecofeminist ontology, going back to the work very early on of Nestor King, of Val Plumwood, who talked about, you know, ontology as the ground for ethics. And then secondly, I look at the sort of the long-standing work in ecofeminist political economy, going back to, you know, the work of Mary Mellor from a very early article published in Environmental Politics that really looks at the importance of looking at the importance of social reproduction, the labor involved in mediating between humans and the natural and material other than human world. So, and really to think about the way that gender inequality and the distribution, extraction, and reproduction of matter are foundational to political economy. And that's such an important foundational ecofeminist idea. And finally, the third strand that I draw on is looking at how ecofeminists have theorized democracy and citizenship, and the fact that ecofeminist scholarship has always been politically engaged scholarship. It has always tried to think about how theorizing can inform social change, and that it has always, you know, thought about how we can extend citizenship to the more than human, and to think about the bodily dependence and fragility of all life and all living beings. That politics has to be thought about in those terms. So yeah, so that is kind of my project, is to bring to the front of our minds these important contributions, and to then invite greater collaboration between people thinking about the new kind of environmental politics of everyday life, including, of course, David's work in sustainable materialism, and really to sort of, you know, yes, invite greater collaboration, but also to say that let's not carry on kind of with these sort of acts of erasure or invisibilizing of that work. Let's think about why it has come to pass that ecofeminism had such promise in the early 90s and then kind of disappeared from the journal, disappeared from being published in the journal. We didn't have those contributions for 25 or so years in the journal. And so why has that happened? I never really can answer that question in my article. I'd like to find out what people think of why that's happened, but also what has been the implications for the development of environmental political theory with that lack of important insight. So yeah, so I feel, you know, I do say that it's come out of frustration. I have been frustrated. I have always kind of, you know, I'm aware that I've been a bit of a killjoy, or I think as Christine once called me a flea on the bum. So a bit of an annoying person to always, you know, mention, but what about gender? What about social reproduction? What about? So yeah, this is my sort of attempt to kind of put it all in one article and see what people think. What do you think, David?
My first reaction is a thanks. Not so much a flea as a kick. But everyone should know, you know, Sherilyn first gave this paper at a workshop, an environmental politics workshop, where I was present and John Meyer was present, who she critiques, and Robin Eckersley was present, who she critiques. And I just thought it was beautiful and brave and incredibly productive, right? I mean, it was, I know you were afraid to give that in that to that audience, but it was a great conversation and a really important one. And I think what's happening is less killjoy and more sort of reawakening. And so I thank you for that. Not so much the title. That's the only thing I didn't like about the piece was the title. But yeah, so let me say a few things about the work that Sherilyn is critiquing in some way. So this work, and I should open by saying we should really talk about the environmental justice work as well, because I mean, I need to think about the shift in my own thinking to, from a more inclusive perspective there. I mean, Val Plumman was everywhere in the second half of that book, right, of the environmental justice book. And I need to think about what happened in between that engagement and the lack of that in this piece. But this more recent work on sustainable materialism is really about the motivations and the theory making in movements that are dedicated to changing material systems and flows, creating these cracks or alternatives to unsustainable food and energy and fashion systems. So I want to start, and maybe this is just thinking about places where we might generate some discussion later. I want to start with some comments on the methodology, because this has been central to my work, and it's not an excuse or an explanation for the absence, but I think it's an important context. The method that has been important to me for the last 30 years has been about exploring the political theories that movements make, not just what theory is relevant from movements, but what political theory do movements make? What is a movement-produced theory about particular issues? So I learned that from a feminist historian, Barbara Epstein, and an ecofeminist, Noel Sturgeon, in the 1980s, late 1980s in Santa Cruz. And I do cite them in the intro to the book. And I've just long aimed to bring that kind of movement-based and, yes, material theorizing into conversation with political theories, starting with pluralism and communicative action in my first book, Justice in my second, and now with New Materialism and Ecological Democracy. So the work is really about teasing out the theories about politics and sustainability in activists that are literally and actively working to change material systems. So I'm looking at people that aren't just buying ethically or growing more food or growing their own chickens or whatever. It's about the motivations and ideas of those who are working to create and support more just and sustainable systems, food and energy systems, or creating more just supply chains for basic things like clothing. So where I start is with the articulations of movement actors. And then I try and understand the theorizing that they're making and try and use that to inform political and environmental political theory. So the first piece in this sort of range of things around sustainable materialism was co-authored with Ram Kohl's in Contemporary Political Theory. And that got at the initial sort of reading out of these movements. There were no interviews there. It was just sort of reading literature and the motivations of movements out of their own writings. And it was more, so we're looking at food movements, we're looking at energy movements. And at that point, it was about crafting. And we can talk about that as well, because Sherilyn gave me some really great feedback there as well, which is one of the reasons we dropped it. So that original article focused on some central themes of these movements, their insistence on active, collective, material, political action, rather than protest or rather than the policy realm. It was really about putting values into practice. The second was the demand to confront the powers behind unsustainable systems. And we argued that they really adopt a sort of Foucauldian embodiment of alternative flows and circulations of power. And then third was attention to an ethos around vibrant and what I call sustainable materialism, which fully recognizes human immersion in non-human natural systems. Now, of course, as I say those three things now, I realize how indebted they are to ecofeminism. This is the first thing that Sherilyn said when she read this piece. So this is not a new thing coming out just last year or this year in EP. This has been a critique of that lack of attentiveness from early on. But what we were trying to do then was trying to illustrate some similarities across very disparate movements, and then try and figure out how they fit with some themes that were being recently laid out. And maybe that's where the ignorance comes in, or the erasure. Looking at some of the recent work, especially in New Materialism, and in particular, those that were laid out by Kuhl and Frost in their collection on the ontology and agency and politics of the term. Now, after that, that project grew. I was lucky enough to get some funding from the Australian Research Council and brought someone else on board and did 100 interviews across 3 countries, in the US, Australia, and UK, 57% women, so 57 out of 100 women. And after those 3 themes, we added a 4th theme, which came out of all the interviews, and that was, of course, social and environmental justice. So again, something that has been core to ecofeminism from the start. What was interesting there was that the concept of environmental justice that came out of the interviews was quite different from the more usual understandings and articulations of environmental justice. It was very rare to hear the word equity, for example. And yes, these movements are quite white, but even among African-American food activists, for example, justice had more to do with community health, social connections. And again, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking it's about social reproduction, right? This is the concept of justice that folks were actually articulating. And it really would have been good to link all of that with earlier ecofeminism, especially Val Plumwood's work, because I always come back more than anyone else to Val's work. And as Sherilyn has so clearly critiqued, the early article also made a huge mistake just assuming this modifier new from New Materialism. And it was really an odd mistake, in part because, you know, we didn't look back at past activism. I mean, there are plenty of activists that have been doing this kind of materialist action for decades. Feminist movements on health, African-American civil rights movements with breakfast, right? The Black Panthers and breakfast. I mean, this is not a new thing, and yet we just took this modifier new from New Materialism without without reflecting on that. And it's, you know, I just have to not only apologize to Sherilyn, but some of my early teachers, right? So I actually took a class with Nesta King, 1988, at one of Murray Bookchin's summer camps in Vermont. I had the ecofeminist Irene Diamond on my PhD committee back when she was still sort of trumpeting the usefulness of Foucault for ecofeminism instead of trumpeting Trump. And that's a really long, unfortunate story. But I do understand Sherilyn's frustration, and this is something else we might talk about, because I'm starting to get this sense now when, you know, I get sent articles, you know, political theory journals or generalist political science journals or geography journals, where, you know, people are making what they think are supposedly new and radical claims, but ones that environmental theorists and ecofeminists have been making for decades now. And I do, so you feel like a killjoy, I just feel like the old dude saying, know your roots, you know, when people are, you know, think they're imagining something new, and it's all been said before. So all that said, when we sat down to write the book, I did take some of the lessons from Sherilyn's earlier critiques on board, in particular that notion of the new. So I remember doing a text search for the word new through the book and deleting and rethinking every time we said that and why, you know, in the initial draft that was there. But also noting the role of a number of ecofeminist authors, as well as the more recent feminist materialists, in particular, as I introduced New Materialism. Now, it's not going to satisfy Sherilyn because I certainly didn't engage, I mean, Nesta King's not that, I mean, I didn't engage ecofeminism as thoroughly as I know Sherilyn would have liked. But I did I did take seriously some of the critiques from early on. So, for example, like I said, Sherilyn talked to me, I can't remember where this was, Sherilyn, maybe you do, but about some of the problems in the crafting movement, right? The lack of attention to gendered norms in some of the sort of eco-crafting and craftivist movements. It's something that I tried to incorporate in some way or note at the end of that contemporary political theory article, but I wasn't satisfied, and clearly Sherilyn wasn't satisfied. But it is one of the reasons why Luke and I, when we were working, shifted the book project, to look more at sustainable fashion than crafting, because it really was more along the lines of what we were thinking about shifts in systems, and didn't have that same really gendered problem. But I think Sherilyn would say that we missed an opportunity there to take on a more critical approach to that craftivist movement and its lack of attention to, as she suggests, who does what in the reproduction of daily life. So I think there's a valid and general critique of the book, that we really don't do a thorough critique of the limitations and the ideas and the practices and the movements that we examined. And I'm okay with that. That's not what the book is about. It really wasn't the focus of the work. It was really about the motivations and the theoretical frames used by activists. What are the meanings being brought in? What are the conceptions? What is the political theory at the basis of the movement? It really wasn't, that's what it was about. It wasn't really an analysis of the success or failure or what movements are missing and all of that. But there should be, and there is, and there certainly is growing in my mind, a research agenda that encompasses a more critical approach to those movements. So then, as we were pulling the book together, we did ask Sherilyn to review a chapter or two, be part of a collective seminar discussing progress, and then again made a lot of changes in response, though I'm sure to Sherilyn's frustration, not all of them. So I think the book is a little less guilty of the charges against the materialist focus than the earlier work, if still not completely innocent. But more importantly, I guess, I'm just deeply and genuinely appreciative of the thorough and consistent combination of critique and support that the project received from Sherilyn, and I should say others there in Manchester as well.
Okay, so the first thing I need to do is apologise to Sherilyn for my flea on the bum comment. It was meant in sympathy, Sherilyn, that you have to consistently point these things out to our community of environmental justice, theorists and scholars. So it was said with empathy and sympathy, rather than as a cold reflection on on fleas and bottoms. Anyway, look, I'd like to take the conversation in a slightly different direction for a few seconds, thinking about how I'm thinking about what can be generated, and that's part of what this whole conversation is about. So where do we go from here? And one of the things that has struck me over the last few weeks as I've been reading and rereading your work, and then again just here listening to you both, is that in both ecofeminist and sustainable materialist movements, and in theory, I suppose, but more importantly in their movements, there's this eschewing of the hypermasculine. So they're not about winners and losers. They're not about domination and submission. They're not about human versus non-human, or competition and status, or power and control, right? These movements all seem to live what they oppose as much as they live what they're proposing, if that makes sense to you. So drawing together these two movements, the ecofeminist movement, the sustainable materialism movements, can you each reflect on how that sort of rejection of the hypermasculine reflects in their values and the values of the movements, and then perhaps a little bit about what that suggests to us, both for politics writ large, but more for our thinking around political theory?
I think this is a great question. It's a really challenging question. And it's sort of really interesting that you've both chosen to sort of zero in on this issue of of hypermasculinities, because to me, sort of in the unmarked category of men, the masculine, and forms of masculinities, it is really the kind of final frontier in environmental politics research, and a lot more research and theorizing needs to be done. Of course, I don't think I say much about this in the article that we're discussing today, although I've tried to bring it to the forefront in other places. And I guess, I mean, there's different ways of coming to answer that really complicated question. And one is to say that ecofeminism has been very keen to theorize hypermasculinity, but I think also it's about hypermastery. And sort of Plumwood's work that so many others have built on is it's interested in mastery and being anti-mastery, and that is profoundly anti-essentialist, because it's not mastery and it's not gendered necessarily. I mean, it can be gendered masculine, but all humans are capable of being hyper masculine or hyper masterful, and hegemonic and toxic forms of masculinities are about hyper mastery, I think, if that makes sense. And so ecofeminism has always tried to understand this and to try and think about how politics can be against the master model. And this is something that Stefania Barca has been writing about recently, her recent very excellent book that returns to Plumwood and fleshes out this point about mastery. So what does this suggest for politics? I mean, I hope that if we can win the argument that is not that this is not a struggle against men or between men and women or feminists and the rest, but against a cultural construction that is both rooted in destructive and harmful forms of mastery and masculinity, and that as a construction it can be deconstructed, then there is promise for a kind of coalition building and solidarity that is needed for fundamental structural transformation. And I would like to think that this work can be done in activist movements, but also in academic circles. And here's where I would like to get white male environmental politics scholars more involved in doing some of the heavy lifting on this, because I think ecofeminists have done a lot of it and have gotten very little credit for it. I think of the work of Greta Gard for a very long time trying to center masculinities and hegemonic masculinities within environmental politics, and it's not often credited. And possibly, the fact that ecofeminists have tried to constantly think about hegemonic masculinities and hypermasculinities and hyper masteries has possibly resulted in why it's being so dismissed and marginalized. So it's an inconvenient set of arguments, or inconvenient truths, perhaps. So I would like to see the conversation happen between ecofeminists and environmental political theory scholars who haven't looked at issues of masculinities in the past. So just as, I think it's the point of just as that white feminists like me have to shoulder the burden of accountability, to quote bell hooks, and a fair share of responsibility to do the dismantling of white centrism, white supremacy, and Eurocentrism in our field. I think so do white male scholars from the minority world need to take on the responsibility for analyzing the role of hegemonic masculinities within the field of environmental politics and climate politics and policy. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but I think those are the things I'd want to say about hypermasculinities.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the you know, the work that's been done recently on toxic masculinity. And you know, one of my colleagues here wrote a piece on truck nuts, and you know, there's been work that's been done on, you know, the belching of smoke. I mean, I had this when I used to live in Arizona, you know, the anti-environmental men who would modify their cars to belch smoke just to piss off people who had, you know, environmental bumper stickers on them. And that kind of, I mean, literally toxic masculinity. So I've been curious about that, but what I haven't done, and Sherilyn, this is, you know, it's a really interesting opportunity, I think, because in these movements, these sustainable materialist movements, a lot of the strategies and a lot of the virtues that people illustrate, emulate, talk about can certainly be linked back to some ecofeminist thinking, writing, some of the ontologies there. And I just hadn't made that connection. So there's a chapter in the book where we talk about, or we try and differentiate these sustainable materialist movements from more individualist movements. And we talk about 3 key strategies: that it's about collective action rather than simply individual action, that it's a prefigurative politics that isn't just about values, but about putting those values into material practice, and that there's a real focus on relationality and material flows in the movements. And then we talked about 4 different, and we called these prefigurative virtues. So a systems consciousness, a humility, a sort of prefigurative humility, a boldness in the face of discomfort, because it's not an easy thing to do, and maybe even because masculinity is challenged. And then, of course, the other prefigurative virtue is care. And every single one of those things that we found in these movements can also be found in various ecofeminist writings, right? And I think one thing that I'd like to do, inspired by Sherilyn's critique and this really interesting question, is to sort of weave together the quite varied work of some of those past theorists in a way that illustrates how activists have taken on and literally embodied and implemented their practices and ideas. And I think, I mean, we didn't really hear a lot about gender roles in the interviews that we did, but of course we didn't push folks on that either. But I just think that would be a really fascinating set of questions to ask activists like that, because the qualities, the virtues, the practices, the strategies are all there, right? They are anti that sort of toxic masculinist. And yet gender isn't discussed as part of the motivation there. So it's a fascinating question, and yeah, really interesting thing to look further into.
Thank you both for sharing your thoughts. I would like to ask you both something more general. I think this was a really interesting, bit more specific focus, and I would like to ask you where you both see possible synergies between ecofeminisms and sustainable materialism more generally. So, you know, after having shown some light through the cracks, metaphorically speaking, so what do you think could be illuminated? You know, in other words, where do you see the transformative potential of everyday politics and, you know, issues of justice and activist practices and grounded imaginaries? So in what ways can ecofeminisms and sustainable materialism come together around these areas of research or even common political goals?
Look, I think where we start is at the end of that piece, because the conclusion that Sherilyn draws at the end of the piece, that the future of an environmental action, of what Robin Eckersley called ecological democracy 2.0, that depends on politicizing and democratizing and radically reorganizing how material needs are met, and how and where caring fits in there. And as Sherilyn says, that's where our understanding and writing about this is thoroughly informed. It should be thoroughly informed by ecofeminisms that shouldn't be forgotten. I should say, we haven't mentioned it, you know, these ecofeminisms aren't all in the past, right? Sherilyn's work isn't limited to criticizing me. I mean, the piece, I think, on the transformative potential of urban environmental activism, the cracks idea, and that potential of place-based and justice-oriented micro movements, which include, I think, some of the sustainable materialist movements. I think that, you know, that really is the beginning of those kinds of synergies. I think, you know, that kind of resistance, that kind of experimentation that Sherilyn talks about, Williams and Gibson Graham and Tonkis and Eric Olin Wright have all discussed. I think it is the potential and the cracks that those movements create that is an area where we most agree and where that synergy is. And in particular, I think in that sort of this idea that we're developing here, Danny Selmayr and I and others, around grounded and situated imaginaries, that they offer something that is an alternative to doomism, an alternative to you know, the tech bro eco-modernism, an alternative to the, you know, just forget about it and suck it up, you know, idea. So I think there's a lot of potential in there as well. And then, of course, there's a lot of obvious potential in and around the idea of justice and justice movements and everyday justice, as Sherilyn notes in her transformation paper. And this is something that is just, I think, in every single one of the 100 interviews that we did. And, you know, for someone who's worked on environmental justice for, 30 years or so, it surprised me. I don't know why it surprised me, but it surprised me that the discourse of justice, in not just environmental justice and social justice, but justice to the non-human as well, was so ingrained in these activists. And again, there's just a long history of ecofeminisms insisting on this, insisting on it, and this is something to talk about, right? Insisting on it as an ontology, hoping that the ontology would then become practice, right? And I think what we're seeing is the practice generating that ontology, right? We're seeing movements, materialist movements that are becoming aware after the fact of that kind of ontology. So there's a whole bunch of different areas, I think, where there's a lot of potential for work together.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said. And I think, you know, that article that you're mentioning, the Social Movement Studies article about finding transformative potential in the cracks, is really about looking at an example of everyday environmentalism that does not fit neatly into any particular theoretical box, right? Like, it's not about putting the work of these grassroots activists into the box of post-political or post-ecological or contentious politics or prefigurative politics or even environmental justice or sustainable materialists. It's really sort of, you know, turning the tables to ask questions about the very practice of what they're doing and what we're doing as academics, and try and build boxes that we put these movements in. And it kind of, you know, I think it sort of takes up, it takes up a very feminist or eco-feminist position that, as you rightly pointed out, is inspired by J.K. Gibson Graham, that I think tries to make two moves. One is trying to resist this top-down sort of strong theory approach, but also resisting the capitalocentrism that seems to shape contemporary research and theorizing on what transformative social and political and ecological change can and should look like or should be. And obviously, you know, capitalism is the driving force of ecological and social injustice, but I don't think ecofeminism has ever said that capitalism is the only thing that needs to be uprooted in order for transformation to happen. So, you know, it has always been intersectional and transdisciplinary, not limited to, you know, a political economy or Marxist intellectual kind of critique or analysis, right? So, you know, I think, you know, politically, you know, this which is this synergy with David's work, is that it's sort of committed to staying grounded in the everyday material struggles of diverse communities, human and not and more than human, which really can't be reduced to anti-capitalist struggles, right? It's about material relationships. It's not just about uprooting capitalism, it's about material relationships that are about flourishing and meaning and care. So I think, I think David and I share a similar commitment to seeing the radical potential and examples of people connecting to and caring for each other, for other species, and for the more than human, in ways that are grounded in the everyday. So, rural women, indigenous peoples, and vast numbers of communities, both in the middle of inner city, underserved and racialized community in Manchester, or to agrarian nomadic peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. These people, it's been going on for centuries in ways that don't count or haven't counted as politics as it has been defined in Eurocentric academia. So that is a real synergy in what these two kind of strands of work are doing. And exactly as David said, these are really rooted in various forms of justice, various understandings of justice. And that is the common denominator and the thing that we definitely share as a starting point.
I would like to ask you one last question and come back to something that you, David, said earlier and made quite explicit, that it is also about methods. And I would like to invite you both, Sherilyn and David, to share a couple of sentences on research practices and thereby moving the focus towards research as a praxis. So not only the forgetting that is built into academia in quest of newness, but rather I would like to invite you to both reflect on what this conversation means to you both for your personal and wider academic research practices. So what can we learn from this conversation for the practice of planning and conducting research, the politics of academic writing, and potential future research collaborations? Thank you.
Well, I guess, my research praxis from the very beginning has always been feminist. So it's always been informed by, some of the great, pioneers of feminist research, like, Dorothy Smith with her feminist research should always treat the everyday world as problematic. For example, people like Maria Mies, whose concept of conscious partiality, it was important. Situated knowledge from Haraway, minor theory from Cindy Katz, Sarah Pink situating everyday life. All of those things, I think, to me, have always been there. And I guess this sort of maybe two points. You said a couple of sentences, but I think I'm going to be having more than a couple of sentences. Two things that I would want to talk about. One is this. I would like to see, and I'd like to practice research that is more consciously, self-consciously collaborative, even maybe derivative and mimetic, as the words I was going to think about. So not thinking about things being derivative and mimetic as negative, but actually positive. And that sort of in a weird way connects to an article that I really value by Jen Hamilton and Astrida Nimanis on composting feminisms. And this whole metaphor of composting as a kind of metaphor for knowledge production, where they say composting is a material labor whereby old scraps are transformed through practices of care and attention into nutrient-rich new soil. And some might find that kind of quite negative or yucky, but actually composting is about being fertile and alive. And I think we should see research praxis like that as well. It's like composting ideas that always kind of come together and create something more fertile and where new things, or other things can grow. The second thing is just to bring it back to justice. And I really want to encourage people to include knowledge justice, or a notion of knowledge justice, into environmental political debates. And so, you know, this would be about sort of thinking about fairness and how knowledge is produced and distributed around the world, sort of as one dimension. So clearly thinking about free access to papers and channeling of resources from the overprivileged to the underserved in the knowledge community. But I guess also thinking about, you know, justice in terms of acknowledging and repaying debts and past harms, I guess. And so I think the work being done by scholars that I mentioned in the paper who are trying to right these historic harms or acknowledge these historic debts is really important. So like, I think you mentioned Sarah Ahmed's, you know, article about a new materialism. Farhana Sultana has done a lot of really important work in thinking about the various, you know, issues of knowledge, justice, and the politics of knowledge production in human geography. And of course, you know, this is, you know, what I would like to call for within an environmental politics as a kind of, you know, recognition of you know, the ideas and the activist engagements that have fed our theorizing. And I think, just to put a bit of a plug in for environmental politics, the journal, I think we have a new chapter of the journal after 30 years. We have a new editorial team. We have a new set of aims and scopes. And part of this is to put the idea of knowledge justice at the forefront and to develop maybe what you could call a more caring and ethical approach to running the journal. You know, to think about being more inclusive of diverse perspectives and a wider range of scholars from different places and at different career stages. And I think that's something, you know, we should celebrate. And, you know, light is shining brightly through the cracks. So it's something quite positive. To connect environmental justice and knowledge justice, that's my point there.
Okay, so we're coming very close to the end of this recorded part of the evening, or the discussion. So I'd just like to perhaps reflect. It's evening for us, it's morning for you, so sorry to have slipped into my personal position. But the format of this discussion asked Magdalena and I just reflect personally on what we've gotten from the discussion and perhaps where we might see this going. And one of the things that keeps coming up for me is around an idea from research in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where, and in the way that Maori are framing research and doing research. And the first is that there are two components to research. One is the kaupapa, which is how we think about and why we do research. And then the second domain is the mātauranga, or the body of knowledge. So we've got the field and the method of research, and then we've got the knowledge itself. But in the kaupapa, in the field of research, the community of research is always engaged in the design of the research project. So the research contributes to the community rather than just promoting the careers of the researchers, as it were. And I'm interested in, as we open up these cracks and as we have the conversation that will proceed from this recording, is what ecofeminist sustainable materialism kaupapa might look like. So what does the field of research look like? Does this conversation point to research that is directed by movements, for community and for transformation, rather than about movements, about communities, and about transformations? And the second thing that's come up for me here is this shimmer of multi-species justice in the work of the communities of the sustainable materialists and in the work of the ecofeminists. So in both of these domains, the non-human realm is included within the spheres of justice. And it's not explicit, it is at least implicit. So, and that's kind of why I say a shimmer. So what research could we think about that opens academic engagement to multi-species justice in a way that communities are conceiving it already? So those are my two thoughts about where this conversation may go once we have a live audience.
Thank you, Christine. That was absolutely beautiful and just reminds me of some of the conversations you and I have had that I enjoyed very much. I think to me personally, this conversation highlights a couple of points, some of which I actually, to some degree, tend to bring up with my own students. So first of all, the importance of rooting, of rooting the existing or the next generation of scholarship that is concerned with intersections of justice, environment, and life in its many forms, of rooting ourselves in what has come before. And I would completely agree that the metaphor of composting is beautiful and very useful indeed. But also that this can be really difficult in light of external pressures of a neoliberal corporatist university setting. And I think it's just really important to stay humble as researchers. And I think I also see the potential in thinking about this in feminist political ecology, for instance, and thinking of the importance of rooted networks in a new, I see the potential there also in a new resurgence of ecofeminisms in its many forms amongst PhDs and early career researchers, and also among students at different stages of their studies, as well as young activists. And at this point, I would actually really like to give a short shout out to the new Feminist Environmental Research Network that was just launched a couple of months ago. So I think the lessons of past scholarship are important, but I also think the directions in which we will travel are less clear cut. So I think while we are moving towards important multi-species, intersectional and entangled research agendas, for me, this conversation is a potential starting point to bring into being research that really brings together the intersectional and the entangled relations in everyday life and identifies possibilities of change. And then finally, I think, thinking about the academy and linking back to Christine's earlier point, on focusing more on community and less on individual academic careers, I would like to appreciate both Sherilyn's continued courage as a feminist killjoy, and also David's openness to be here today and have this conversation. So I just want to thank you both for that. And earlier on you used the terms making yourself vulnerable. And I think a certain degree of vulnerability is really important. So to have the courage to be vulnerable and to remain open to being challenged. And to me personally, this highlights, the importance of decentering an academic identity based on individual prestige, and instead centering research that is guided by affinities and community of thought, community of practice, and bringing into focus, shared political goals, but also overlapping histories of scholarship and thoughts, and also personal connections, and the many ways in which our ideas can grow when we allow ourselves to be challenged. And I think, at the end of the day, what we aim for this conversation to do is to identify and open potential areas for new collaborative research, and while also acknowledging that and listening to what has already been said. And I think we would really like to take this as an inspiration to now invite those who are in the audience with us, or will be in the audience with us, to really reflect on what this conversation can mean. Thank you.